It is March 5th, 2025, and the U.S. Director of the CIA has confirmed that Washington has cut off intelligence sharing with Kiev. This comes just days after the U.S. confirmed it was cutting off military aid to Ukraine. But when you look at these statements that are being made, they all talk about how this is temporary. This is trying to get Zelensky to make a deal, trying to get him to be serious about peace in Ukraine, and on and on. But if Trump were to resume military aid, to resume intelligence sharing, that would also be a statement in and of itself, in the same way that it is a major statement when he cuts it off. So, what is the Trump administration's actual plan here, right? How are they going to keep dealing with Zelensky, and could we see a possible minerals deal between the US and Ukraine coming up in the coming weeks? We got into all that and more with a special guest earlier, and yes, Mr. Jax is here to say hi. He's here to let you know that if anything in my work resonates with you, that you can always support it by signing up as a monthly paid subscriber over on my pages on Patreon and Substack. You can also send a one-time donation over on my page on Buy Me a Coffee, and we really appreciate all of your support, don't we, Jax? Yeah, he's just looking at me because he knows that he's getting a treat after this and he's ready for it. So without further ado, let's take a listen to today's interview. Joining me now to discuss is Patrick Henningsen, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and host of the 21st Century Wire. Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Great to be with you, Rachel.
Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as earlier today, CIA Director John Ratcliffe and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz confirmed that the U.S. has cut off intelligence sharing with Kiev following a report from the Financial Times on Wednesday, which also said that Washington was prohibiting its allies from sharing U.S. intelligence with Ukraine. Now, they are kind of presenting this as temporary, basically saying, hey, we want to make a deal with Zelensky, so this isn't forever. But what do you make of this update and kind of how the Trump administration is proceeding with this pressure it is really putting on Kiev?
The way I'm looking at this is just purely from a strategic point of view. If the U.S. is serious about bringing this war to a close and wants to get to a ceasefire and then to a negotiated settlement, what could happen in the interim is very dangerous. For instance, if we look back at the last 3 years, Rachel, we've seen times when there have been sort of movements or statements that look positive. All of a sudden, Ukraine goes and attacks a target inside the Russian mainland, or some kind of provocation, or hits the Kerch Strait Bridge. And the British have also kind of been involved in some of these operations as well, and as well as other European partners, kind of egging on Kiev to do these provocations, to derail, and also Zelensky himself, in order to derail any potential negotiations, has gone and attacked Russia. So by doing this, by cutting off intelligence, by what the U.S. is doing, put a pause on intelligence sharing, things like targeting information, Russian troop movements, strategic and tactical information, putting a hold on that so as not to give any additional capability for Zelensky and the radical nationalists in his cadre there to basically derail any chance, because you know how Russia is going to react with another attack in Russian. They're going to hit back hard, and all of a sudden we're back to square zero on that. So Washington wants to avoid that. I personally, that's the way I'm looking at this, and it also shows that Washington is dead serious to Kiev and Zelensky, and to the European countries as well, that Washington is serious about bringing the fighting to a close. So they don't want to be playing a role in any of that. Also, Rachel, the other thing is, this is a war between the deep state in the US, the mainstream media in Europe, the elites, political elites in Europe. The intelligence services might have a very different agenda, the military industrial complex, than what the populist right or the Trump administration have in the US. So there could be a conflict there. This is also putting a firewall between any potential catastrophe there in the interim while they're trying to negotiate something.
Yeah, and I think that's one of my biggest concerns right now because, when we look back over 3 years ago, when Russia set out what it described as a special military operation, it specifically talked about demilitarization and denazification. And they said, look, we have all of these right wing extremist neo Nazis in Ukraine that at that point, and still even today, are targeting civilians in the Donbass region, targeting ethnic Russians there. And so that element hasn't gone away. It may have been hurt in a variety of ways by the ongoing war, but it still exists. And so when people like Zelensky and others around him, surrounding him and his government, when they start to feel desperate and they start to think, okay, we could really be losing here, losing this war, losing Western support, they could then start to act out. And when you look at the position that Russia is in, I know they have been incredibly patient over the last few months as you had the Biden administration in its final weeks, literally bringing us to the brink of World War III. You had Russia saying, we're going to respond. And then they didn't necessarily directly respond for a lot of those attacks that were happening. How do you see Russia in the current position that's in, where I'm sure they do want to believe Donald Trump? They want to believe that he's sincere and that his administration wants to pursue normalization. But at the same time, they're also moving forward cautiously, knowing that there is a lot more in Washington than just Trump and his followers.
No, good question. I think Russia is very conscious of the chain of events that have led up to the present day. Do you remember Ronald Reagan had this old saying, "Trust but verify." The Russian version of this right now is don't trust and verify. The United States, they're not going to trust the United States. So Lavrov has made it very clear that he doesn't believe the U.S. are agreement capable. Because of pulling out of the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, pulling out the INF. That was the Trump administration. So they're very cautious. I'm sure they're positive about this new Trump 2.0, and they're very, I think, positive in Moscow about it. But also they're very very aware that even if they have an extended deal, that a Democratic administration could come in 4 years, or a new Democratic House, and somehow derail some of the progress that they might be making right here. So at the end of the day, this really comes down to who holds all the cards, who controls the facts on the ground. And right now, I think Russia is in control of the majority of the facts on the ground. So Ukraine's not in any position to negotiate with Russia. And quite frankly, neither is the United States. The only way the United States can get any meaningful negotiations with Russia is if they absolutely play a role in giving something concrete, something substantial to the situation. And I think that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. They're trying to win the trust of Moscow so they can proceed to the next phase, because it's ceasefire, then it's negotiations, and that is a big gulf in between those two things. Like, there's a lot of politics, European problems, and machinations of former European powers that you have to deal with there. And as you can see now, they're already at it, basically going head to head with the United States on this issue, which is kind of shocking. And you could even see a split in NATO. That's another potential crisis as well, politically anyway, that could come in the interim here. And so, meanwhile, Europe's doubling down on funding. They're saying, von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, saying 800 billion euros. This is equivalent to the U.S. defense budget, obviously stretched out over a few years, but they're talking about financing European defense spending to that tune. That's like we're preparing for World War III, basically. And so I don't understand it, Rachel. If the U.S. is having detente and rapprochement with Moscow, why would Europe be afraid that Russia is going to attack Europe? But that's what they're saying to justify this hawkish stance right now in Europe. It doesn't make any sense at all. I'm hoping that sanity will come and fill the void instead of something crazy filling a void of the U.S. backing out of the Ukraine situation. There's a lot of crazy European actors that have their own ideas and settling scores of World War II. We're seeing Poland, the Polish leaders tweeting out very abrasive comments about what the Russians did in World War II. I can't believe we're seeing this from European leaders. It's so inappropriate. but that's Europe. This is what it is.
Yeah, they almost kind of expect that the average person in the public will have just forgotten about World War II, right? Just don't look back, even though it was only a few decades ago. Don't worry about that. And it's like, no, if you look at Russia, they remember World War II very clearly because they do not want to go back to that. They paid a very, very big price there. And you brought up where von der Leyen stands. I was actually looking at that plan and they're referring to it as the rearm Europe plan. And I mean, you're talking about $840 billion to spend on defense. And the only way that I can make sense of this, and I don't, there's so much that we don't know, but it brings me back to what Trump has been calling for years now, since his first term was, look, members in NATO need to pull their weight. They need to increase their defense spending. And then he comes in for the second term and he's saying, hey, you guys need to take on responsibility for Ukraine. We're now seeing a version of that. I think my concern moving forward is that you had US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth just last month when he was at the Ukraine Contact Defense Group meeting. He was telling his European counterparts, hey, we need you guys to really focus in on Russia and increase your responsibility for Ukraine because we want to focus on China, right? We don't want to have to deal with Ukraine. We want to be able to focus over here. Now, obviously, that doesn't really work if the US is trying to pursue real normalization with Russia because Russia and China are allies and Moscow is not going to put up with that. But how do you view this position that the Trump administration is currently in, and then kind of how that correlates to where Europe stands, where it's like these European leaders have had months knowing that Trump was coming in saying he's done with Ukraine, he's ready to move forward. And it seems like they're just now kind of scrambling, being like, okay, we've got to, up our defense spending and we've really got to act. Well, they could have done this months ago if they wanted to.
Yeah, a little bit of contradictory statements and policies by the US there, because at one hand they're saying we need to de-escalate, we don't want World War III, and then the other hand they're saying Europe needs to spend more on defense. And so they're making peace with Russia, but then they're basically almost pushing Europe to have a bigger military sort of position in opposition to Russia. And Kaja Kallas, who is the deputy minister there at the European Commission. She's from Estonia, and she said recently in an interview that we need to defeat Russia so that we can go on to defeat China. How can we defeat China if we can't defeat Russia? I mean, just from a small Baltic country that's got a GDP the size of a sort of mid-size city in Illinois. This is Estonia. So it's like it's crazy. So what are they talking? Where are all these hawks coming from in Europe? And one can only conclude, Rachel, one can only conclude that they belong to a special class of bureaucrats and technocrats, and they have their, let's say, their cohort in America, many of whom are neoliberals in the Democratic Party and members of the Republican Party, the defense establishment, the financial class, those people who stand to gain from military buildups and war. Look at the defense stocks in Europe through the roof. You make more money putting your money in defense stocks in Europe than you will in gold right now. That's how good the stock market is for the European defense sector. That's where all the money's flowing right now. So is it any surprise that you're hearing all of these leaders just so enthusiastic about war? I'd like to see their stock portfolios and see where they're making their money or their families making their money or etc. So that's there's a lot of that element to it. So you can't be serious, the Danish prime minister challenging Putin to war. I mean, Denmark of all countries. So they're almost it's like it's a bluff, and they're just counting on the fact that Russia isn't going to take the bait, and I don't think Russia will take the bait. Russia's concerns, or national security concerns, are very, very focused on the situation in Ukraine. Threatens their national security and NATO as well. So, I mean, that's just going to have to get resolved one way or another. So, it's just, to me, unfortunate that Europe has descended down this path and regressed from a lot of the progress they've made after the Second World War, stabilization, economic success, and here they are basically trying to mobilize the entire continent, including the UK, to fight an enemy that wouldn't have been an enemy if they hadn't pushed them so hard with NATO, and if they hadn't armed the Ukrainian armed forces to attack the Donbass and kill thousands of people. And there was a UN resolution, it was 2202, to implementation of the Minsk Accords and a ceasefire in 2015, and they absolutely sandbagged it intentionally to buy time to arm Ukraine. So we're saying this is Russia's fault or unprovoked war of aggression. No, this is all propaganda. This was a provoked situation. Clearly, this is historically proven. Scott Horton, great American pundit and historian, has written a book called Provoked, which details chapter and verse how this situation came about. So to hear European leaders saying Putin's war of aggression, full-scale war, they have all these terms that are prefixes. Anytime they make a statement, it has to be Putin's unprovoked war of aggression, Putin's war of choice, full-scale war. You hear this every time. It's like a script. And the reason is because they're setting up for basically disqualifying any chance of any diplomacy. And they're saying Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. That's not true. That never happened. That was provoked by the U.S. backing Saakashvili, who was president of Georgia at the time, to attack South Ossetia. Russian peacekeeping forces were there. That caused a conflict. So, but the reason they keep drumming up these old propaganda lines is saying there's a pattern of aggression by Russia. They can't be trusted. We cannot negotiate. Therefore, we must confront them militarily, and Putin must lose. Putin cannot be seen to win. This is another quote you see. And so that's what it's all about at the end of the day. A lot of this is vanity, and a legacy, the collective ego of former European grandeur. And of course, they have some transatlantic brethren who believe that too in the United States. And these are the people that want to keep this conflict going. And Zelensky and Ukraine are basically just a battering ram for that collective vanity project of NATO and Europe. And so it's very tragic and very sad. Ukraine is the biggest loser of all. You know, the Ukrainians are the biggest losers of all. And sad to say, the sooner Zelensky goes and exits off the stage, the better this situation is going to become. That's my hope, because I think he's become the problem, because he's the figurehead, he's the mascot of this absolutely disastrous proxy war. He is the figurehead. As long as he's there, Europe's going to rally around Zelensky, and we're not going to be any closer. Russia's not going to go to the table with Zelensky. He's out of mandate, and they don't regard him as the legitimate leader of Ukraine. So again, another impasse, another obstacle. It's Zelensky. He's the guy in the way. So
And it's been interesting to see the response from, I know, certainly from Trump, obviously, after they had that meeting last week. And you kind of saw Zelensky on full display, right? You saw the fact that not only can he not stop himself from talking and interjecting, but he also expects to be put up on a pedestal by everyone around him, in large part because that's how he's been treated for over 3 years now by all of these different NATO allies that just kind of parade around him and act like he's so great. And even on top of that, even when Zelensky did put out a statement, he did not apologize for his conduct. He called the meeting regrettable, right? He said, hey, let's move forward. Let's work out a deal to give the US access to rare earth minerals. It's all fine and good. When you view the position that Zelensky's in, and he has made it really difficult to replace him in part because he has
yes.
banned all of the major opposition parties in Ukraine. So it's like he's already put himself in this place where he's nationalized the media. He's gone after anyone that disagrees with him and claims that, oh, he's fighting corruption. So how do you view the position that Kiev is in right now? And does that matter? I mean, if obviously the US and Russia, they can work out a deal. They don't really need Kiev. So how much does Zelensky and his regime, how much do they matter in the grand scheme of things?
I think when he came in initially into power, he campaigned on two main things. One is he was going to have an independent investigation to find out who the snipers were in Maidan Square in 2014, and that would dispel a lot of speculation that this was a false flag, that this was engineered in order to cause a complete explosion politically in the country, regime change, and so forth. He didn't do that. He also said, we're going to have peace in the Donbass. We're going to implement the Minsk Accords. He didn't do that either. So the two main things that got him a landslide victory in 2019 against Poroshenko, he never came good on. And look at the results. Absolutely disastrous. So since that, so he became very weak, and he became a sort of beholden to the hard nationalist right in Ukraine. And then what he did, he's turned out to be, for by all accounts, people, if you listen to some of the reportage of his former advisors, and they'll say he's become a very Machiavellian, very canny operator. And what he's done is he's only in power because he has placated the hard right and the neo-Nazi elements, the street thugs, the real henchmen in charge in Ukraine. He's managed to placate them by keeping the war going, saying that we're never going to give up until we get every inch of our territory. That's what they want to hear. But then he can stay in power because he is the money man. He's convinced everyone in Ukraine that he is the key to money flows into Ukraine. So when he goes to Washington, he wanted that meeting in front of Donald Trump in the Oval Office. He wanted the photo op to be sitting there in his green outfit, sitting next to the President of the United States, signing a deal that sends a message back to Ukraine that Zelensky is going to deliver billions to whoever the grifter class is in Ukraine and whoever's benefiting from this endless war. And the same in Europe. He's there with all the European leaders, hugs and kisses. And so he must be almost like a god to some of these people. He's their ATM machine. So if they lose Zelensky, they could lose the money. So he has the support domestically from the class who's in the managerial class and the beneficiaries of the war, and maybe even some of the military establishment in Ukraine. Okay, but the reality is, average Ukrainians, the people who have to send their sons, their brothers, their uncles, their grandparents in some cases to the front lines for this failed, disastrous NATO proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, these people will not support Zelensky in a election. And you're starting to see some noises now in Ukraine. You're seeing some protests. You're seeing some dissent, despite all the things that you talked about before. Donald Trump, inadvertently or not, has opened up a conversation, which is now happening in Ukraine. And Zelensky's reaction will be to be more authoritarian. The problem is, even if they demanded elections, it would take so long to allow opposition parties to come back, to allow opposition media to come back, and to allow people to campaign and canvass on the ground to have fair elections in Ukraine. They could have elections tomorrow, but who's going to win those elections? Zelensky. He's already boasted on camera just this week when he came back from Washington, it's going to be very difficult to get rid of me. So, I mean, that was kind of a really spooky segment to watch there. And you could see that is the Machiavellian Zelensky. That is besides the sort of, looks like, the hero of wartime, victim of Russian aggression. No. Is the Machiavellian Zelensky would love to have elections tomorrow because he would have absolute control over it. But elections in 6 months, free and fair elections with opposition campaigning. During that period, if you allowed opposition campaigns, parties, people to speak freely about their opinions, what that would do to Ukrainian conversation politically, it would be like a complete explosion of opinion and differentiations of views on the war. Why are we doing it? Who started it? Who's responsible? The whole facade would crumble at that point. This is the paradox that Ukraine is in right now politically. And I think Washington is beginning to understand this. Europe also knows this, which is why they do not want to budge. They want to keep their guy in, and they don't want anything to change. So this is such an interesting time. And I always tell people, military, yes, gear, tactics, but what's really important is the politics. The politics is what makes things possible or not possible. And the politics in Ukraine, very important. Just like the politics in Israel could potentially derail Benjamin Netanyahu and this entire, ethnic cleansing project, which has been going on there. it might come down to if the political will or the political system or power collapses, it causes a cascading effect where all bets are off at that point. That's where Ukraine is right now. So this is extremely interesting time.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me how you think about, exactly as you were saying there. This is all built on so much propaganda, right? This idea that Kiev could win, that they could quote unquote beat Russia, that having the backing of the West was all that they needed, and that Zelensky was the guy who was going to lead that to them to that charge. In the same way that, exactly as you were saying there, you've got Netanyahu over here and so many people in Israel that are justifying genocide every single day. And you look at the position that Ukraine is in, and it's like, yeah, there are a lot of people that have been lied to, not just for the last 3 years, but going back to, 2013, 2014. And it'll certainly be interesting to see where things go from here, how far this, Trump versus Zelensky feud goes now that we're seeing the Trump administration actually taking some action. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Patrick Henningsen, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and host of the 21st Century Wire. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also catch Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and we'll see you next time.